Hello, folks. Welcome to another edition of Inside the Marble Palace, Post Media's look at Saskatchewan politics from the view of the legislature that's now sitting. I am Murray Mandrick. I am political columnist for the Regina Lear Post and the Saskatoon Star Phoenix. Joining me as always, Jeremy Symes, our political reporter. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi.
And hopefully a familiar face to all you from the Canadian press, Mickey Julich. I hope I got that. Did I get that
You
right?
did. You did not, but that's
I did
okay.
not. I never do. Isn't it? Mickey is the Canadian press reporter and does a lovely job for Canadian press covering all things in this province. One of the things that she was covering this week was a story that everyone is talking about, although no one is quite sure why we're talking about it as a story because we're not 100% sure it's a story, but because it involves Premier Scott Moe, it was a story. Mickey, can you tell us what we know about the Premier's car being impounded in Vancouver this week, and what basically, I guess, where that's about where we need to start. What do we know about the whole incident?
We don't really know much. We know that Vancouver police last Thursday had pulled over a car with Saskatchewan plates, and a 28-year-old driver had failed a roadside sobriety test and was issued a 90-day suspension. The driver was also ticketed for running a red light, but police say no criminal charges are pending. Make that very clear. We don't know who was driving the car. We know that the premier was in Regina because we saw him and interviewed him.
Yep. Yeah.
So we don't know who the driver was, but the vehicle was registered to Premier Scott Moe, which I think is why people are interested in this. And all we know from the premier is that it was a family or friend that he is supporting during this time, and he's made it clear that he wants this to remain a personal issue. And while he entertains our questions, he doesn't say much past that. He's helping a family and friend during this time, as we are all called on from time to time.
It's obviously a tough situation, and I think immediately we all sensed that it was a difficult personal situation for him to handle, and his repeated uh, words that this is a personal matter were heeded by all of us. But what was his tone and mood like when he finally did go before the scrum as soon I could finally, but as soon as he possibly could actually on Tuesday when he did sort of account for the matter. What did you sense of his tone, Jeremy?
I found his tone to be it seemed like a very serious thing to him. It seemed a little bit tense. It seemed like he didn't really want to talk about it either. I know he was asked multiple different questions. Was this your son? He said no comment. Lots of no comment, no further comment. And when you asked him, has this been tough for you? He said yes, and it was kind of under his breath almost, and it was you could just tell he was really affected by this. And we honestly we don't know too much of these details, but you can tell he's kind of taking it seriously, I think.
It's hard to watch them go through tough situations that are of a personal nature like that, and because they're public figures, they're exposed to that. And it was a tough week for him overall, Mickey, because I was almost more intrigued by his reaction to Prime Minister Zelensky from Ukraine speaking to the House of Commons. He seemed, I don't know if you sensed this too, Mickey, but he seemed somewhat emotional about it. I don't even think that's the right word, but he certainly seemed moved by it. And describe that scenario from your perspective in terms of what you saw in that particular scrum, because I think it put a whole different light into some issues surrounding Ukraine and how it affects this province. But just let's talk a little bit about how Premier Scott Moe reacted to that speech in particular.
Yeah, well, he did watch the speech. I believe from his office, he ended up tweeting a photo that he was watching Zelensky's speech to Parliament, and he did talk about it after, and it just did seem like he did take a few takeaways, particularly about the part where Zelensky references imagined Canadian monuments and those being bombed. I think that really resonated with the premier and really did. I mean, the premier has obviously taken this very seriously, but I think it just added that other layer of why it's so important to, help Ukraine as much as we can, and what is this government doing to step up to support that.
And Jeremy, there is a huge connection beyond the connection of how many people in this province have roots of some sort or the other, going back to grandparents, great grandparents, etc., that came from Ukraine. We do have a situation where there's a serious issue with Ezra's place, that's run by one of the oligarchs, Abramovich, or has been run by one of the oligarchs that was specifically targeted in London and in elsewhere to take away profits from this. Now, this was a very difficult situation for the government to handle because this is also the Evraz being a steel company in Regina that builds pipelines, which of course the government fully endorses and supports, particularly since they build pipelines. That they had a very difficult time, I think, articulating their position perfectly. Tell us what was said, I guess, on Monday when the premier wasn't here, and maybe the change of tone in the scrum that Mickey talked about, in when we actually got around to talking about Evraz and where the government might move.
Yeah, for sure. There definitely has been a change of tone. This is a big employer in Regina, and I think the government realizes that, and they are realizing maybe now, or in a sense that they want to take it seriously. So the NDP has originally brought this up and said, hey, let's take this issue seriously with Evraz. They're a larger company, the shares are falling, it's in debt. What does this mean for the workers here if, the company goes into receivership, needs a creditor protection, that sort of thing? So they're talking about, let's have a discussion about a change of ownership with Evraz. Let's see if we can facilitate different talks so this company is no longer connected to Russia, and then therefore it operates kind of independently, and we don't have to worry about it having to close because of Russian issues and with the war. Anyway, so on Monday this was brought up, and it was really highly politicized by Jeremy Harrison, the trade minister. He was saying the NDP was fear mongering on this issue, and he also said, we're not going to nationalize Evraz. Like, why would we want to have that conversation? And so a day later, we see Premier Scott Moe come in. He's asked about Evraz again by the NDP, and he's saying, we're having discussion, dialogue with the federal government. This is an issue we need to work closely with the federal government on. And you could just tell he was taking it a lot more seriously and just understanding that we want to protect these jobs at Evraz because, it is a huge employer in Regina. So we did see that change of tone, and the NDP acknowledged that change of tone. They were happy that the government is taking it more seriously. I will add, with those discussions, Mo kind of hinted that, they are having those serious discussions about what levers may need to be pulled under what certain circumstances. He's not going to say what those are publicly because this is a private company after all, but there is some action happening, I think.
I
It was
think
that.
if you don't mind me
Yeah, absolutely,
interjecting for a
please.
second, I think it's also important to note too that last week the premier made it clear that he hadn't even talked to the federal government about this issue, and it wasn't until the federal government sanctioned Roman Abramovich, who is a huge shareholder of, or a large shareholder of Evraz, that Premier Moe started talks with the federal government, and that also, I think, and he started to initiate the conversations with Evraz too. So prior to Abramovich being sanctioned, the premier was not reaching out to the federal government on this issue, and this week he made it very clear that discussions are ongoing and will continue to be ongoing. So I think in the change of tone, that has also been pretty major on his part.
It's funny in the government in terms of its approach how it does have to change tone from issues where I'm not saying they're not taking seriously, but in terms of how they do things. And I think one of the really good illustrations was your story related to abandoned wells this week. Mickey, can you tell us a little bit about that story? Because I found that one fascinating as well. It's not quite related to this particular thing, but I don't want to forget about this story because it was an important one for the public out there. What was your story about? And it was excellent work, by the way. I'll let you tell it because it's your story.
Thank you. So the story, even though it came out this week, it wasn't new. This information has been publicly out there since December, where the auditor had her latest report. And essentially, she audited the Ministry of Energy and Resources. And back in 2020-21, when the federal government gave Saskatchewan $400 million to deal with oil well cleanup and help with, essentially the industry as it was facing low gas prices as a result of the COVID-19 and commodity prices being low. They kind of gave this stimulus money, $400 million, to the province. And so they started dishing, so they put together a program so that they could start dishing out this money to oil and gas companies to do the work. It's an important issue that the government says needs to be done. Everyone's on the same page. But what had happened is the first $125 million of that $400 million grant money that they received, they had given to companies without first getting order in council approval. And the auditor told me that that's important to have for the sake of transparency, and also so that the government knows what money ministries are spending and where that money is going. So not only does it benefit the public, but it also lets cabinet know what's going on. And they did end up obtaining that order in council for that $125 million in grants that went to oil and gas companies, but they obtained it in February. And I did ask the auditor, was any money missing? Was anything nefarious? And she said, no, we audited the Saskatchewan Research Council who received this money, and they're kind of the mediator that takes the money from the government and then doles it out to these oil and gas companies. She said nothing nefarious is going on. All the money was there. They still have money in the bank, and that all the money was distributed fairly. So really this story is about following government processes and why that's so important, especially when you're dealing with significant amounts of money.
And it's fascinating, too, because it should be that way with most things, including the Evraz story. But sometimes, and maybe it's because it's been in the government that's been in power for a long time, they tend not to. I don't know why sometimes, but I don't know if it's because they think they can cut corners or that they do, but they just miss this process. And then they find out, no, we actually have to make sure our ducks are in line before we do that. It's not all about the politics sometimes, and you spoke earlier about how that gets played. There was a little bit of politics, by the way, I think, in the meeting this week between the Premier and the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities. Certainly, it was a good political audience for him because the Premier seemed right in his element. What were the main issues that you saw arising, Jeremy, out of the SARM conference this week? And maybe you can speak of sort of a bit of a difference in terms of tone, because I sensed that the Premier was extremely comfortable in that environment. And it wasn't just because no one was wearing masks.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. This is pretty much his base. These are rural voters. These are Sask Party voters for the most part. So he was definitely in his element here. The news item that came out was they have put forward a petition to the federal government, and they are calling for rail service to be an essential service because right now CP has issued actually a lockout order to its workers over a dispute over their contract right now, which would mean, workers can't work the railway, goods can't be shipped, and that's not great for producers, farmers, Saskatchewan's economy, the supply chain, all of that. So he's basically saying, make this an essential service so that, rail lines can keep moving, trains can keep moving, and say the trains do stop, please put in a stop work legislation order so you can order these people to work. This got political. The NDP talked about it and they said, we're not supporting this petition because we still kind of respect the rights of workers. What they're saying is, let's put the heat on CP and make sure they are being fair in this deal for workers. So there was a motion actually in the legislature today that went forward related to this debate. I don't know if it's passed yet. They might still be talking about it,
Sure.
but that's where we are with that. Other things at SARM, highway funding. Obviously, people think our highways are terrible, and the government needs to step up on that. And yeah, overall, I think the Premier was speaking with his people, and they were very receptive to him.
Do you sense the same thing, Mickey, in terms of how he responds to different audiences? Because I think this is kind of what this is about. I think they see a political opportunity in speaking to people, as Jeremy described, that would clearly, squarely fit within their base. and are very serious about delivering the message as they did in the legislature today, with once again what amounted a fair bit of a procedural kerfuffle as to who got to deliver whose motion on this particular issue, with the NDP really wanting to avoid the term back to work legislation as something they wanted to vote on.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with Jeremy that he was speaking to his base. I mean, seeing him walk in with his RCMP security detail, I think he walked in with the health minister, Paul Merriman. They look like rock stars coming up those steps. People loved it, and he had his little entourage going. And I think too, that I think it's easy for him to be a rock star in a setting like that because his views do align politically with many in the audience. And I did note too that even during the bear pit, when questions were being answered to certain ministers and ministers couldn't, adequately respond in some cases, the premier would always answer the question and say that he would follow up. So even though, yes, it is his base, I think it's important for him, just based on what I saw at SARM, for him to deliver these answers to these people. And I don't think he minds in a setting like that, even though while being a rock star doesn't mind being held accountable, because he did face some heat also with the state of the roads in this province.
Yeah. I will just add quickly, like COVID was hardly mentioned during that meeting. There was no
Right.
questions from delegates about COVID. And I think the premier briefly mentioned it, just saying, they're looking forward to kind of being done with this even in a way, even though they still acknowledge it's a thing. Yeah, so you can just see where that message aligns with the base there.
I find it fascinating because as we're recording this, we're still sitting there waiting to see the COVID numbers in detail. We talked to the minister a little bit more than an hour ago, and he claims to have not seen the numbers already. They only come out once a week. They used to come out daily, and we used to and the minister used to acknowledge that, yeah, we would get them first thing in the morning, and we would make our assessments in terms of our numbers. At that point, they still only held maybe weekly or maybe twice weekly press conferences at the height of COVID, but they don't even do that right now in terms of this. Mickey, do you see this issue as being over for them? Like, I mean, it's still a situation where we're having big trouble in hospitals right now, mostly because there are a lot of people still being admitted to COVID. It's even if people aren't getting quite as sick. And secondly, we've got a lot of hospital staff that are getting sick from COVID, and it's really getting difficult to handle.
Well, the Minister of Health, Paul Merriman, did say that COVID is not over, and he's been very clear in all his scrums that COVID is not over. This is something that they're still focused on. I think that there is, based on what they have said, there are people who are less interested in talking about it, and I think that they are just responding to that as a government and navigating on, well, how much information does the public want to see. And I should note, too, that, Chief Medical Health Officer Dr. Saqib Shahab, when he announced that we were going to weekly reports, he said this was also going to be a much-needed break from many of the employees who have to work long nights or early hours putting these reports together. It's very time-consuming. And so while it is also less data, he did say that it was going to be a reprieve for some of these workers. And we've also seen now, as the government said, we're not going to be the only province that is switching to weekly reports, and we're now starting to see that from other provinces as well. I believe Alberta is also going to be switching to weekly reports. So I think that they've been saying this for months now, that other provinces were going to follow in this direction. So I think Saskatchewan was the first to do it, but I wouldn't be surprised if soon we're at a point where, we're seeing most of Canadian provinces deal with this. And I also should note, too, that the government has been very clear that they are monitoring this, and if cases surge and hospitals continue to increase, they're going to pivot, and nothing is off the table. And even Dr. Shahab, when I interviewed him a few weeks ago, said that, measures are never off the table. And if there is a resurgence that goes to unmanageable levels, that, the government will review what needs to be done.
It's fascinating to me because they have so many problems, as I think we'll see in the upcoming budget next week, dealing with not just COVID, but retaining doctors, retaining well, actually not retaining, but dealing with the backlog of that have been surgeries that have been postponed with a high surgical wait list. It's going to be a very challenging budget coming up next week to deal with a lot of this stuff. So, just I guess quickly as we wrap up, guys, what do you think we're going to see is the government's emphasis in next week's budget? Uh, uh, it seems that it's going to be somewhat torn between the whole issue of debt and deficit and how to move forward on that versus still dealing with the ongoing problems in healthcare and otherwise. Jeremy, what are you looking for?
Yeah, for sure. I think we're definitely going to see those investments in healthcare deal with staffing levels, maybe hiring more staff, and the surgical backlog, like you mentioned. Like they're really going to hammer that. Mo did talk about these renewed investments in capital as well, so I'm looking for some of that. But at the same time, he's talking about we want to work our way to balance. So my big question is just really how are they going to kind of spend more in certain areas while also focus on balancing and where do they draw the line in a way? So that's really what I'm watching
Yeah.
for sure.
What do you think you're going to be writing about in a week from now, Mickey?
I Health care is a big one. I mean, it kind of
Yeah.
goes to your question: are we over COVID? I don't think we can be over it because now we're just starting to see governments deal with the aftermath of the system and how it was impacted. So I think even if some people do want to choose to ignore it, I don't think we can. And I think that we're going to see the government deal with, as Jeremy said, the backlog of surgeries and also how we're going to pivot to have private services provide some of these procedures for people. I'm curious to also see if there's going to be some maybe government funding for harm reduction. I know that overdoses deaths are not improving in this province. People have been calling on it. Ministers have been asked about this throughout the year, and they've kind of been hinting that we're still reviewing it. So it hasn't been a no. So I'm curious to see if that's going to be the case. And I think just also coming out of SARM, for me, it will be where so many municipal leaders were talking about, the state of highways, and they want more investments in their roads, especially if, trains are not running, then we're going to have to rely on trucks more. And what's the damage is that going to cause on already these damaged roads? And so I'm curious to see if there's going to be more projects announced for highways and maybe more infrastructure related to schools and hospitals as well.
So much going on, and fortunately, that's about all the time we have for this week. But before I go, thank you, Jeremy and Mickey, for this. But let's have a special thank you for Mark Melnichuk, who's leaving us and who's produced pretty much every one of these episodes up until now. Mark, we're going to miss you. Thank you so much for your time, your trouble, and all your efforts, and just being a great co-worker. So we'll dedicate this one to you. Bye, Mark. Thanks a lot. And thank you, Mickey. And Jeremy, we'll see you next time on Inside the Marble Palace.